They laughed at the shortcut because it broke every rule they trusted. No rails, no order, just endless trucks moving through dust and darkness. Then the front didn't stall. The old system did. In the summer of 1944, victory in France did not hinge on tanks or bombers. It hinged on something far less dramatic: movement, roads, fuel cans, tires grinding forward through dust and darkness. When Allied forces broke out of Normandy, the front did not advance in a clean, deliberate line. It surged. And in that surge, the greatest threat to the campaign was not German fire, but empty fuel tanks. At first, the problem was invisible. The landings had worked. The beaches were secured. Paris was within reach. To many commanders, the war appeared to be entering its final act. But behind the front, the logistics system was already failing. Ports were damaged or still in enemy hands. Rail networks were shattered by months of bombing. Pipelines had not yet been laid. Every mile the armies advanced stretched supply lines thinner, until doctrine itself began to crack. American planners had designed their logistics around caution and predictability. Supplies would flow from ports onto railways, then forward in controlled stages. That system assumed time. It assumed intact infrastructure. France in August 1944 offered neither. Trucks idled, units waited. Fuel consumption rose faster than forecasts had ever imagined. The advance that was supposed to end the war threatened to stall itself. That was when a temporary idea surfaced. Not elegant, not permanent, not even particularly safe. A one-way road network. Thousands of trucks, minimal regulation. Drivers instructed to keep moving, day and night, regardless of weather or fatigue. A rolling gamble that traded precision for speed. It was, on paper, a shortcut. Something improvised to buy time until real logistics could catch up. Many laughed at it. The skepticism was immediate and loud. Senior officers questioned the waste. Engineers warned about road damage. Safety officers predicted accidents. Some saw it as a publicity stunt rather than a serious solution. Others dismissed it as a stopgap that could never sustain an entire army, let alone multiple armies pushing eastward. Logistics, after all, was supposed to be methodical, controlled, boring. What was being proposed looked reckless. Yet the alternative was worse. Without fuel, armored divisions could not exploit breakthroughs. Without ammunition, infantry advances slowed. Without food and spare parts, morale collapsed. The front did not need more firepower, it needed motion, so the shortcut went ahead. What began as an experiment quickly became a lifeline. Trucks rolled in long convoys, marked for priority passage, bypassing the bottlenecks that strangled traditional supply routes. Drivers slept when they could. Vehicles broke down and were abandoned at the roadside. Repairs were improvised, rules were bent. Efficiency was sacrificed for continuity. And something unexpected happened. The flow did not collapse. It accelerated. Day after day, the volume increased. Fuel reached units that had been preparing to halt. Artillery batteries stayed active. Mechanized columns kept moving. The advance resumed its momentum, not because German resistance weakened, but because American logistics refused to stop. What had been mocked as a shortcut began to replace the system it was meant to support. The irony was impossible to ignore. The very features critics had condemned, simplicity, redundancy, brute force, proved decisive. Instead of a fragile centralized network, the front was being fed by sheer scale. Thousands of small decisions made by drivers, mechanics, and officers on the ground compensated for the absence of railways and ports. The line did not collapse because it was weak. It collapsed because it was too rigid to survive the pace of the war. This was not a story about trucks outperforming tanks. It was a story about logistics overpowering doctrine, about an army learning in real time that movement could matter more than destruction, and that supply could dictate strategy just as much as strategy dictated supply. By the time critics realized what was happening, the shortcut was no longer temporary. It was carrying an entire front on its back. And it was only just beginning. Welcome to WW2 Forgotten Fronts, where the untold battles, hidden heroes, and overlooked machines of World War II finally come to light. Here, we uncover the stories history left behind, the frontline diaries, the lost operations, and the moments of courage that shaped the world, yet rarely appear in textbooks. If you enjoy deep storytelling, cinematic narration, and forgotten perspectives from the war, you're in the right place. Make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and share this video. Your support helps this channel continue bringing these forgotten chapters of history back to life. Now, let's step into the past. The success of the shortcut created a new problem. It worked too well. American logistics doctrine before 1944 was built around hierarchy and control. Supplies moved in measured waves, tracked on paper, synchronized with timetables that assumed predictability. Railways were the backbone. Trucks were meant to bridge short distances, not replace entire networks. What was unfolding in France violated every assumption that system depended on. The road convoys did not wait for orders to trickle down. They reacted to need. If a division burned fuel faster than expected, more trucks were pushed forward. If artillery demanded shells at double the forecast rate, convoys rerouted themselves in motion. The system no longer flowed from the rear to the front. It pulsed, responding to pressure like a living organism. This unsettled senior planners. The shortcut had been authorized as an emergency measure, not as a replacement. Yet each day it expanded. The planned logistics structure fell further behind reality. Rail repairs lagged. Ports remained constrained. Pipelines were months from completion. Meanwhile, the front kept moving, and it was being fed almost entirely by rubber tires and gasoline. Officers trained to think in diagrams now faced a system that could not be diagrammed. There was no single choke point to control. No neat ledgers showing where every crate went. Supplies arrived because drivers kept going, not because paperwork was perfect. Losses were accepted. Inefficiency was tolerated. Speed became the only metric that mattered. Critics pointed out the costs. Vehicles wore out at brutal rates. Accidents were constant. Roads deteriorated under the weight of endless traffic. Maintenance units struggled to keep up. From a traditional perspective, the shortcut looked like a slow-motion collapse waiting to happen. But at the front, commanders saw something else entirely. They saw divisions that were supposed to pause instead push forward. They saw exploitation forces outrun German withdrawals. They saw pressure maintained where, under normal logistics rules, the advance would have stopped cold. The shortcut did not just support operations, it reshaped them. Plans began to change around it. Rather than asking whether supplies could sustain an advance, commanders began assuming the flow would continue and adjusted objectives accordingly. The logistics tail no longer followed the strategy. Strategy began following logistics. Where the trucks could go, the front went too. This inversion was revolutionary and deeply uncomfortable. Logistics officers found themselves arguing not for restraint, but for expansion. More trucks, more drivers, more fuel allocated to the supply system itself, even if it meant less for combat units in the short term. Feeding the convoys became as important as feeding the guns. At the same time, German planners struggled to understand what they were facing. Allied air power had devastated railways precisely because doctrine said rails were the enemy's lifeline. But now, destroying rail lines did not slow the advance as expected. The Americans were bypassing the very infrastructure Germany had prepared to defend and sabotage. The shortcut had no center to strike. A bridge destroyed here meant a detour there. A road cratered at night was bypassed by dawn. The system absorbed damage rather than collapsing under it. What looked chaotic was, in practice, resilient. This forced a reevaluation at the highest levels. The question was no longer whether the shortcut was sustainable. It was whether returning to the old system would actually make things worse. The very rigidity that once ensured efficiency now threatened paralysis. Doctrine was being rewritten by exhaustion and necessity. By late summer, the temporary solution had become indispensable. Units depended on it not just for fuel and ammunition, but for confidence. As long as the trucks kept coming, the advance could continue. If they stopped, everything else would stop with them. The shortcut had crossed a point of no return. It was no longer an experiment feeding the front. It was the front's spine. And the longer it ran, the clearer it became. The real collapse was not coming from overuse of roads or worn-out vehicles. It was coming from the old idea that logistics had to be elegant to work. In France, elegance had already lost the war. The shortcut did not run on paper. It ran on people. Thousands of drivers were pulled into a system that barely resembled the army they had trained for. Many had never expected to see the front. They were mechanics, labor troops, service units. Soldiers whose role, according to doctrine, was to stay behind the lines and keep things orderly. Now they were being asked to drive straight through the aftermath of battle, night after night, with no margin for delay. Most of them were African-American soldiers. The Army had segregated its units, limiting black troops almost entirely to service roles. Yet when the shortcut expanded, it demanded manpower faster than the system could discriminate. Experienced drivers mattered more than appearances. Endurance mattered more than rank. And so the convoys, filled with men who had been denied combat recognition, now carrying the war forward 1 mile at a time. Their instructions were brutally simple. Keep moving. Do not stop unless forced. If a truck breaks down, pull it aside and continue. If you get lost, find another convoy and follow it. If you are tired, you drive anyway. There were no hero speeches at the roadside. No medals waiting at the end of the run. Just darkness, dust, and the constant pressure to stay in motion. The risks were constant. Head-on collisions on narrow roads, vehicles overturning under overloaded cargo. Enemy aircraft probing for targets of opportunity. Mines left behind during German withdrawals. Exhaustion that blurred judgment and slowed reaction times. Every trip carried the chance that a driver would not return. Yet the convoys kept growing. Drivers developed their own rhythms. Some sang to stay awake. Others chewed coffee grounds. Many learned to read the road by feel, sensing vibrations through the steering wheel that warned of trouble before it appeared. Informal repair crews formed on the fly. A truck that should have been written off might be coaxed forward for another 50 miles, just long enough to deliver its load. This was not efficiency as taught in manuals. It was survival engineering. Commanders at the front rarely saw these men. What they saw were fuel levels holding steady, ammunition stocks replenished, rations arriving on time. The system worked precisely because its human cost was hidden behind motion. Every mile gained at the front was paid for by fatigue in the rear. The irony was sharp. The army that prided itself on planning now depended on improvisation. The doctrine that emphasized order now relied on chaos, disciplined only by urgency. And the soldiers most often overlooked were doing the most to prevent collapse. There was resentment, but there was also pride. Drivers knew the front would stop without them. They felt it in the urgency of the demands, in the way officers stopped asking questions and started pleading for deliveries. They were no longer an accessory to the war. They were its engine. As weeks passed, the shortcut hardened into routine. Routes were marked. Traffic control units adapted. The endless flow of trucks became a familiar sight to civilians and soldiers alike. What had once looked reckless now looked inevitable. But beneath that appearance of stability, the strain was mounting. Vehicles were wearing out faster than replacements could arrive. Drivers were operating at the edge of physical collapse. Fuel consumption to sustain the system itself climbed higher each day. The shortcut had solved one problem by creating another. It demanded to be fed. The question was no longer whether the convoys could keep going. It was how long the men behind the wheel could endure before something finally gave way. As the shortcut expanded, it stopped being invisible. What had begun as a logistical workaround now stretched across northern France, like a moving artery. Thousands of trucks, flowing day and night, carved predictable patterns into the road network. Dust hung permanently in the air. Civilians learned to step back as convoys thundered past. Allied units learned to wait, knowing that sooner or later, the trucks would arrive. And so did the Germans. German commanders had always understood logistics in theory. Cut the rails, destroy bridges, starve the front. That logic had worked for years, but in late summer 1944, it stopped delivering results. Rail sabotage no longer produced the expected paralysis. Bombed junctions were bypassed. Captured depots were replaced by moving stockpiles on wheels. The supply line was no longer a place. It was motion. That made it difficult to stop, but not impossible. German aircraft began probing the roads, not in massed formations, but in sudden low-level attacks. A truck destroyed here, a fuel tanker ignited there. Mines were left behind during withdrawals, timed not to block entire routes, but to introduce fear and hesitation. Every explosion threatened to ripple outward, slowing the flow just enough to matter. For the drivers, the war became personal. They were no longer operating behind the front. They were inside it. The line they sustained had become a battlefield of its own. Every trip carried the tension of exposure. Headlights dimmed, convoys spaced out, engines kept running even during brief stops to minimize vulnerability. Traffic control units struggled to maintain order under pressure. Accidents increased as drivers pushed harder to compensate for losses. Wrecked vehicles littered the shoulders, silent reminders of what happened when momentum faltered. Yet stopping to clear them was often impossible. The priority was always forward. At higher levels, concern grew. The shortcut was still working, but its margins were shrinking. Fuel delivered to the front now had to cover not only combat consumption, but the fuel burn to deliver itself. Tire shortages became acute. Spare parts lagged. Maintenance schedules were ignored because vehicles could not be spared from the road. The very success of the system made it fragile. If traffic slowed too much, the front would feel it within days. If the convoys halted entirely, armored units would grind to a stop almost immediately. There were no stockpiles to fall back on. The war had become a just-in-time operation, balanced on constant movement. And still, commanders demanded more. The front was widening. Multiple armies were advancing simultaneously. Each breakthrough created new distances to cover, new roads to saturate, new points of friction. The shortcut was being asked to do what it had never been designed to do: sustain an entire theater indefinitely. Some officers began to question whether the system could survive its own importance. The answer came not from planning rooms, but from the road itself. Despite losses, despite exhaustion, the flow continued. Drivers adapted. Routes shifted. Night movements increased. The line bent, but it did not break. What German attacks revealed was not the weakness of the shortcut, but its nature. There was no single failure point. Damage was absorbed locally. A destroyed truck meant delay, not collapse. A cratered road meant rerouting, not paralysis. The line could be hurt, but not cut. By the time German planners recognized this, the strategic window was closing. The advance had been sustained long enough to reach positions where new ports, new depots, and new infrastructure could finally come online. The shortcut had bought time at the most critical moment. It had done so by refusing to stop moving. Yet everyone involved understood the truth. This could not go on forever. Either the system would be relieved by a return to conventional logistics, or it would burn itself out. The line was still holding, but the cost of holding it was rising by the mile. By early autumn 1944, the shortcut had reached the point where, by every rule of logistics, it should have collapsed. Distances were longer than ever. Vehicles were worn past design limits. Driver fatigue was chronic. Fuel consumption to sustain the flow was approaching absurd levels. On paper, the system was no longer efficient. It was cannibalizing itself. Any planner looking only at spreadsheets would have ordered it shut down. Yet shutting it down was no longer an option. The front had grown dependent on continuous motion. Armored units planned advances, assuming fuel would arrive. Artillery schedules assumed ammunition would be replenished. Infantry operations assumed rations would follow within days, not weeks. The shortcut was no longer supporting operations, it was embedded in them. This dependency created a dangerous paradox. The harder the system was pushed, the more vital it became. And the more vital it became, the less room there was for failure. A temporary slowdown now carried strategic consequences. A missed delivery no longer meant inconvenience. It meant stalled offensives, exposed flanks, and lost momentum. The pressure rolled downhill. Commanders demanded priority. Logistics officers demanded more trucks. Maintenance units demanded time they would never receive. Drivers absorbed the strain silently, measuring success not in miles driven, but in whether the convoy arrived at all. This was the moment German planners had been waiting for. The expectation was simple. The Americans would outrun their supplies. The advance would slow, counterattacks could stabilize the line. The war would regain shape. It was a rational expectation, one built on every previous campaign of the war. It did not happen. Instead of collapsing, the shortcut adapted again. Loads were redistributed. Some units accepted shortages so others could continue advancing. Routes were shortened wherever possible. Traffic was prioritized ruthlessly. The system became less fair, less balanced, but more effective. Logistics stopped trying to serve everyone equally. It served momentum. This choice was critical. By concentrating resources where breakthroughs mattered most, the Americans preserved pressure at decisive points. The front did not advance everywhere, but it advanced enough. The enemy was denied the pause it needed to reorganize. What looked like inefficiency was, in fact, selection. The line thinned, but it did not snap. At the same time, conventional logistics finally began to catch up. Damaged ports were repaired, railways reopened in fragments. Pipelines crept forward behind the armies. These systems did not replace the shortcut immediately, but they relieved it, load by load, mile by mile. The shortcut had done its job, not by being perfect, not by being sustainable, but by existing long enough to bridge the most dangerous gap of the campaign. When the pressure finally eased, the realization set in. The war in France had not been won by a single decisive battle or technological leap. It had been held together during its most vulnerable phase by a system that was never supposed to exist. The shortcut survived precisely because it ignored the rules designed for peacetime order. It failed upward. And in doing so, it carried the war past the point where failure was still possible. Only one question remained. What happens when the system that saved the front is no longer needed? The answer would reshape how armies thought about war itself. The pressure eased slowly, almost imperceptibly. After weeks of living on the edge of exhaustion, the convoys began to thin. Not because they had failed, but because they were no longer alone. Rail lines reopened in fragments. Ports started to breathe again. Pipelines crept forward, replacing urgency with steadiness. And as these systems returned, the shortcut quietly stepped out of the spotlight. Having carried the war across the most dangerous stretch without ever being meant to survive it. Only in hindsight did its real meaning become clear. What collapsed was not a road network or a fleet of trucks worn down by overuse. What collapsed was a belief. The belief that wars are decided primarily by firepower. that victory belongs to whoever builds the better weapon, delivers the harder blow, wins the most dramatic battle. In France, in 1944, that belief proved incomplete. The Allies did not win because they destroyed everything in their path. They won because they never had to stop moving. The shortcut exposed a truth that doctrine had long obscured. Momentum is fragile, and once lost, it is almost impossible to regain. German forces understood how to absorb blows. They understood how to trade space for time. What they could not handle was an enemy that denied them pause. Retreat after retreat failed to create breathing room because supplies kept arriving. Defensive lines unraveled not under sudden shock, but under sustained pressure that never quite let go. Logistics became strategy, not the elegant, invisible kind planners preferred, but something raw and physical. Drivers pushing through exhaustion, vehicles sacrificed for distance, efficiency abandoned in favor of continuity. It was not pretty. It was not sustainable. But it was decisive exactly because it refused to wait for perfection. And that is the uncomfortable lesson. The shortcut succeeded not by being optimal, but by being sufficient at the exact moment sufficiency mattered most. It absorbed losses, tolerated waste, and accepted human strain in order to preserve forward motion. In doing so, it carried the front past the point where German planners could still reset the war on their terms. This is where the story stops being about World War II. Because the logic that saved the front is not confined to battlefields. In life, we are taught to value planning, optimization, and readiness. We are told to wait until systems are in place, conditions are right, risks minimized. And most of the time, that advice is sound. But there are moments, rare, critical moments, when waiting for the perfect system becomes its own form of failure. The Red Ball Express teaches a harsher, more human truth. Progress sometimes depends on imperfect action sustained long enough to matter. Momentum, once established, can compensate for inefficiency. Motion can solve problems that planning alone cannot. And resilience often comes not from strength, but from the willingness to keep going while adapting in real time. Applied to modern life, the lesson is stark. Careers stall not because people lack talent, but because they wait for certainty. Projects die not from bad ideas, but from hesitation at the wrong moment. Change rarely arrives with clean logistics. It arrives messy, demanding endurance before it offers clarity. The shortcut worked because it accepted reality as it was, not as doctrine wished it to be. It did not ask whether the system was ideal. It asked whether the front could keep moving today. That question still matters. So here is a simple one for you. When facing uncertainty, do you believe it is better to wait until everything is ready, or to move forward imperfectly and adjust along the way? A. Wait until conditions are ideal before acting. B. Act with what you have and adapt as you go. Please share your answer in the comments. Your perspective may help others wrestling with the same choice. And if you value stories that go beyond battles to reveal how wars and lives are actually sustained, consider subscribing to WW2 Forgotten Fronts. Your support helps keep these overlooked lessons alive and gives us the motivation to continue exploring the hidden forces that shape history.